Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. I hope you've been well. This is the way of life of gods and divine, happy human beings. The release from everything here. A way of life that takes no pleasure in things here. The refuge of a solitary in the solitary. Thus ends the Enneads, the magnum opus of Plotinus, that philosopher of late antiquity, generally taken as the founder of Neoplatonism. Plotinus is talking about the life of the philosopher, a life, you could say, of the Platonic lover, of reproducing in the beautiful, a life in which one is able to rise to a vision of the absolute good or one, and thus to find a higher pleasure than we take in our attainment of mundane objects of desire. Guided by that vision of the good or one can live a good life, one ordered by virtue and lit by happiness, a life in which self-dividedness, the great problem of being human, has been to some degree overcome. So goes the teaching of Plato and those like Plotinus who followed in the Platonic tradition. But we might find something a bit jarring about this quote from Plotinus that ends his great work. A kind of melancholy that may strike us in this phrase, the refuge, it's actually normally translated as a flight, but the refuge or flight of a solitary in the solitary. Of course, we can feel love for all kinds of things, including the good or one, and yet it seems undeniable that the keenest and most important kind of love for all of us is for other people. And it would be strange if Platonic love were an exception to this. Surely it must, in some important way, be social. At the same time, we have to admit that this idea of the life of the philosopher as deeply introspective seems like a theme that we've seen emerge throughout this whole series. After all, we've talked many times about how, according to this teaching, human desire is ultimately satisfied with that object that is not an object, the absolute good or one, and how our ascent to this is by looking inward, by a radical openness to our own feelings. So the question arises, what is the role of the other in Plato's teaching on love? How is real Platonic love not an essentially solitary pursuit? Well, one thing that's worth noting at this point is that although we have finished in this series with the famous speech of Diotima on Eros, we've not actually finished with the dialogue in which that speech is set, the symposium. And as though precisely to answer the question that has arisen for us, this last part of the symposium abruptly shakes us from any sort of rigid introspection that may have settled over us and takes us back to social life and all the otherness that comes along with it. Actually, we've already had some indicators that social life is an essential part of Plato's teaching on love and desire. We've talked in this series, for example, about how, while on the one hand, the end or goal of human desire is kind of knowing, the vision of the good or one, this is a kind of knowing that is fundamentally unlike that which we experience in ordinary moments of reflection or introspection when we move by abstract thoughts about this or that mental object. Diotima has spoken of this kind of knowing as reproducing in the beautiful, which led us to speak of this kind of knowledge as kinetic. It's as though we come to know the good through doing the good, through virtue, through acting, as though Plato is reluctant to draw a hard and fast distinction here between this kind of knowledge and action, almost as though it transcends the difference we know in the everyday world between thinking and doing. And so for the one who ascends Diotima's ladder, the fulfillment of Eros is both in that vision that comes in a sort of passive way. There's a sense in which the vision of the good is something one receives, but also in virtuous action, action in human community. She winds up her speech, which is also the wind-up of Socrates' speech, since we remember her entire speech has been retold to us by Socrates. She winds it up by saying that humans become immortal insofar as they give birth to true virtue, which those who have ascended the ladder are able to do because they're in touch with absolute beauty. Now, in this last section of the symposium, we're suddenly given a powerful example of the role of the other in Platonic love, how other people are necessary for us both to be in touch with that absolute beauty or goodness, as well as for us to live out that virtuous action. We've talked about comedy in the symposium, and this passage is certainly the dialogue at its most comedic, I think. Socrates has just ended his speech when suddenly the Athenian politician, general, and all-round colorful character Alcibiades bursts in, confessing his thoroughly drunk state and proceeding to talk to the assembled company in a suitably uninhibited way. We realize at this point there's a rather complex set of infatuations involving Agathon, Socrates, and Alcibiades, and that certainly Alcibiades has spent some time wanting to be Socrates' lover. There's a certain frivolity with which relationships are described here, at least on the surface. Underneath it, I think, is something actually quite powerful. I think it's clear that Alcibiades is revealing not just his attraction to Socrates, but a deep love, and that he believes that that love has, if I can borrow language from the Phaedrus, actually given wings to his psyche, shown it the way to a better life. And there's something for us all here, I think. First of all, Socrates, the beloved other, is necessary for Alcibiades to ascend to a better life because he elicits in Alcibiades feelings, and feelings point to the good in some way, if we are radically open to them. Socrates wakens people to a greater awareness of their feelings. In particular, Alcibiades says, through inspiring a certain kind of shame that they're not living a better life. Shame, of course, is generally not a pleasant emotion, and yet the shame Alcibiades is talking about here points to the good in a sort of negative way. By making the psyche aware of its own poverty, it impels it to something higher. Socrates is, of course, a particularly unique example of a beloved person. But this really is what all our relationships with other people do. It is really only in the presence of the other, after all, that we fully experience emotion, whether that other is another person actually present or a kind of mental other with whom we're having a silent conversation. This is especially true of our very early lives, this importance of the other to emotion. When we're infants, we really only learn to experience emotion when our emotions are recognized and affirmed by a loving other. So our relationships with other people allow us to experience that vast spectrum of feeling that inhabits our inner lives, a spectrum which, as we've said earlier, is really eros just diffused into the manifold forms it can take, as though passing through a prism. But Alcibiades' speech also shows us how our relationships with other people take us to that ecstatic state which is the fulfillment of eros. They allow us to experience the feeling of pure love, and being in a state of pure love is the closest we can get to knowing the good or one. Alcibiades gives a speech in praise of Socrates in all his particularity, not just his unique physical appearance, but also the characteristics he has that make him unforgettable. Socrates is drawn to beauty, Alcibiades says, but not for the sake of objectification or possession. The aim seems to be purely contemplative. Yet, Socrates lives a life not of pure introspection. He possesses a rare physical courage, we're told, seeming unafraid on the battlefield. As a whole, he is unique, says Alcibiades. He is like no one else in the past and no one in the present. And then a little later he says, this man here is so bizarre, his ways and his arguments are so unusual, that search as you might, you'll never find anyone else, alive or dead, who's even remotely like him. The arguments Socrates comes up with, Alcibiades says, are, quote, truly worthy of a god bursting with figures of virtue inside. They're of the greatest importance for anyone who wants to become a truly good man. I think we can see in this pure and heartfelt praise of Socrates by Alcibiades something we spoke about much earlier in this series. We catch a glimpse here, I think, of the oceanic experience Freud spoke of, in which the boundaries of the ego seem to expand to include the other. Really just another way of saying the boundaries of the ego dissolve to some extent. Love is the most ecstatic, the most oceanic of emotions, because in it we transcend this sense of the good of self versus the good of other. They become in some sense identical. At the same time, love actually transcends the apparent opposition between introspection and extrospection, because it involves both in a kind of mutual interplay. We wouldn't be able to experience love if we didn't already know the good in some way, if we hadn't had this introspective experience of seeing the absolute good and knowing that it transcends one's particular good. And yet, for love to realize itself requires the other. It requires this actually lived unity of self and other. When we find ourselves in this unity, we perceive the good in the most direct way. We see the desire for the good in the other as we get glimpses of the inner life of the other. And we also thereby see the good itself at work in the other. And we also glimpse the good as one. The idea of absolute goodness and absolute unity being in some way identical in this experience of oneness. Alcibiades at one point says Socrates reminds him of a statue of Silenus, a kind of nature spirit, the inside of which in Athenian marketplaces apparently was hollow and filled with statuettes of gods. It's interesting that he should say this because we see a strikingly similar theme in the Vita Nuova of Dante Alighieri, the short work I've mentioned before in earlier episodes, written almost 1700 years later in Italy. In both Alcibiades' speech and Dante's little book, the beloved other provides us with an access to the divine. Dante's Vita Nuova is peppered with these mysterious associations between his beloved Beatrice and the number 9. And then only toward the end, after he has decided to write only in praise of her, does Dante reveal that he realizes in retrospect that she herself was the number 9, rooted in the Trinity as 9 is rooted in the number 3. For both Plato and Dante, the beloved other is a conduit to the good because the good becomes actual, makes itself manifest to us through the human psyche. And despite that rather melancholy note that may have struck us in those closing words of Plotinus's Enneads, the refuge of a solitary in the solitary, we note in the rest of Plotinus's work teachings in line with Plato in this regard. On the one hand, we see in the Enneads an emphasis on that introspection that is an important part of the tradition of Platonic love. There is indeed a sense that introspection is necessary for the vision of the good. At one point, Plotinus writes, quote, "The soul should withdraw from everything external and revert entirely to its own inside, without any inclination to anything external, in order to see the good or one." And yet, and this is absolutely essential, the absolute good or one that in some way one sees in this is the absolute good or one for everyone. It recognizes its own good as the universal good, the psyche does, and it glimpses absolute oneness in its own unity. And so we get to this wonderful passage of Plotinus that I've quoted before, quote, "Is it then the center of the soul, or psyche, in a way that we are looking for? Or should one realize that there is something else, like a center in which all centers, in a way, coincide? Unquote. A 2021 paper by Daniel J. Nolan, a scholar at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, and it's like a lot of academic papers, it's got a fairly long name. The Flight of the All-One to the All-One, the Fuge Manu Pros Monon as the basis of Platinian altruism. The paper makes a similar point on the real meaning of these closing words of the Enneads. Plotinus's reference to a flight of the solitary to the solitary. The introspective experience of the mystic necessarily spurs that person to loving engagement with other people. Nolan points, for example, to the life of Plotinus that his student Porphyry wrote, which depicts Plotinus living not as a hermit, but as a highly social person, taking in orphans, for example. It's in fact really a kind of communal life given over to teaching and friendship. Nolan writes, Plato's understanding of unio mystica, mystical union, renders the mystic more integrated with the world rather than less. The flight to the one is a flight towards a supreme unity with the rest of being. An expanded sphere of concern is a result of mystical experience. Thus, the standard portrayal of the, quote, flight of the alone to the alone, unquote, as an isolationist turn fails to portray the way in which this flight unifies the mystic with the whole of being. And I like to think that in this life for others, Plotinus's knowledge of the good or one was being fully realized. By the way, that was the end of that quote, mystic with the whole of being. But I like to think that in this life for others, his knowledge of the good or one was being fully realized. He was, as Diotima would put it, reproducing in the beautiful. It's hard not to think here of one of the favorite images of Plotinus, this divinely inspired choral dance, which he uses when trying to get across the idea of beauty as unity in diversity, or in other words, living unity, rather than just abstract unity, just the bare idea of unity, real unity, really. Perhaps the most memorable of these instances is toward the end of his work, in the 9th tractate of his 6th Ennead, which conveys this wondrous beauty of psyches striving together for the good, as though each of us supports the others in some way. Each of us has a tendency to turn away from the good or one that is the object of our true desire, and each of us needs to be turned back toward it. And this turning away from and back to the good or one is at the same time a turning away from and back to the harmony, the beauty of virtuous and loving social life, of living at one both with ourselves and the other. And Plotinus writes, we are like a chorus that, singing all the while, though relating to the chorus leader, may turn outwards from the spectacle. And the spectacle he's talking about is the action in a Greek play. It may turn outwards from the spectacle, but when it does turn towards it, the chorus sings beautifully and does in truth relate to the chorus leader. And a little later he continues, when we look towards it, the spectacle, that is journey's end and rest. And that's a phrase lifted from Plato's Republic, journey's end and rest. That's journey's end and rest for us, and the end of discordance for us, dancing round it, a divinely inspired dance. So, as I mentioned, I think last episode, we're quickly approaching the end of this series. In fact, I anticipate the next episode will probably be my last. And in this last episode, I'd like to return to something I discussed in some of the earlier episodes of this series, the nature of this spiritual or psychic problem that besets our time, and why, in my view, Plato's teaching on love and desire responds to it in a particularly powerful way. I hope you can join me then, and until then, be well, and thanks for watching.